Hey. Thanks, everyone. We're here today talking about regulating the on-demand economy, and here with me is Brian O'Malley from Excel, and you specialize in investing in the on-demand marketplaces, right?
Yeah, all sorts of marketplaces.
Awesome. And Oisin, you are the CEO and co-founder of Handy, correct?
That's right.
And Handy's a marketplace for ordering, on-demand handymen and cleaners. So I guess first off, the on-demand economy is going by a bunch of different names, but basically there's 26 million people in the US that are working part-time as part of this economy, whether you're calling it the gig economy, the flexible economy, on demand. What do you call it, and why is that name significant?
Yeah, I'll go first. So I don't know if I have a great name. I think on demand is the wrong name, though, because at the end of the day, trying to fulfill services on demand is almost the hardest part of this economy. It means you have to build up a ton of supply ready to go at any minute. And the real interesting thing is you now have a ton of different types of workers, whether they're cleaning houses, whether they're delivering food, or we're starting to see much more intellectual tasks that go further down the spectrum, are smartphone enabled, ready to go, and the ability to show up, earn either full-time living or earn supplemental income in a way that's never been possible before. And so we really look at it from the worker out, whereas I think a lot of people who are more consumers of this economy think about it from the standpoint of pushing a button, getting something done.
Right.
Yeah, I think we're really missing a trick here. I think we name things from our own perspective. So exactly what you're talking about it, we talk about it from the point of view of a consumer. And that makes sense because everybody thinks from their own point of view, they understand things from their own vantage point. But if you really understand what's going on, you really dig in, what's happening on the supply side is probably even more interesting than what's happening on the demand side. So you've got people working on Uber, on Lyft, on Handy, on Instacart, and they're delivering services in an amazingly flexible way. They're dipping into this part of the economy. They're never giving Handy hours or schedules or calendars. They're simply saying, hey, I want to work at a particular time, and there's work there. And if we were naming it entirely from their point of view, from the point of view of people working on these platforms, we'd call it the flexible economy. We'd really recognize that people are choosing to work in this sector because it gives them flexibility. This idea of a 40-hour work week where you have your shifts dictated by somebody else, it's really an old concept, and we're missing so much by calling this the on-demand economy.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really interesting is that you have these populations, right? So you have a lot of people graduating college where there's not a whole lot of jobs available to those folks. You've got people coming back from the military who are now looking for additional work. You have people who retired who still want to be doing something and don't just want to play golf all day. And so from a worker standpoint, the whole idea of it used to be you would interview with someone, you would largely have a complicated interview process. Now you show up, you work, and the quality of your work really dictates, in some cases, how much you get paid, but in a lot of cases, how much work finds its way to you in the future. And so getting rid of that process and enabling people to show up, work a job, see if they like it, and if they like it, continue to do it based on the quality of their work. It's a very different hiring process. And with these populations trying to find a livable wage and trying to find a good income, it adds a lot of opportunity to people that otherwise might have gotten lost in the shuffle.
Gotcha. And is this workforce something that's been around for a really long time, or is it really just starting to blossom now with on-demand apps and things? I mean, as far as being an employee goes, right now, still you're either 1099 or W-2. You're freelance or you're employed.
So the laws does anyone know what the FLSA is? FLSA? No hands. So the FLSA is a piece of legislation that was created in 1938 that largely informs this classification of work, that links employment to benefits, that links all these things together. And obviously we've had iPhones for probably 8 or 9 years now. We have the App Store. We've had Uber for 6 years. And so much has changed since that legislation came about that it really doesn't match what's happening today. You've got about 700,000 people working across Uber, Lyft, Handy, and Instacart. And they're choosing to work in this part of the economy because it's flexible. They're choosing to work here because they don't want to give someone availability in hours. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't have access to benefits, access to education, access to training. But there's this false choice that the law has created right now between those things. And I think that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. You mentioned in the beginning that you've got 26 million Americans working part-time. Most of those folks are actually W-2. So these are folks who are not clipping the 30-hour work week to have access to benefits, and yet it's this false, choice that's being created right now by legislation that we've really got to figure out how to improve.
Yeah, and it's something that it's not really just about the startup companies either. If you look with Obamacare and how that's impacted employers, you have a lot of large-scale employers that have actually shifted more people to part-time than full-time from a cost perspective. And so this is something that I think impacts workers more broadly than those that are just participating in this part of the economy.
And what's happening regarding this in Washington right now?
So I think that part of the problem is we framed it the wrong way. So we framed it as the on-demand economy. And I think as leaders of these platforms who have so many people working on them, so I mentioned the over 700,000 people working across those top four, you've got tens of millions of consumers using these platforms. We have a role to educate folks in Washington to really go down and explain this is why people are choosing to use these platforms, to really emphasize that this is incremental or supplemental income, exactly as Brian has said. 80% of the people on Handy work 20 hours a week or less. 50% work 10 hours a week or less. These are folks who are dipping into the platforms, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to say, okay, just because you're only working that number of hours a week, you can't have benefits? That doesn't make sense. We've got to figure out a portable benefits program so that people can say, okay, I only want to work that number of hours, but I can still have access to benefits, education, and training.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversation in Washington is almost that startups are taking advantage of people. At the end of the day, people are voluntarily showing up because of the flexibility it offers. And when we were looking hard at the whole food delivery space, I went and drove for a bunch of platforms that kind of figured you can't invest if you don't.
Did you get a good rating?
I don't know. I didn't do it long enough to know, but probably not.
That's a no.
Yeah, probably
That's
not.
A no.
But anyways, you talk to the different drivers who are doing it, and a lot of it comes back to just this opportunity where there's no other way to voluntarily work a couple hours and get paid for it. And so when people think about an extra $100 a week, an extra $200 a week, and how that can impact themselves personally or impact their family, that opportunity is really impressive and is really interesting. But I think the view in Washington doesn't really come from the worker perspective. It looks at some of these companies and the market cap that they've created, and there's a feeling that people are getting taken advantage of, as opposed to the platforms are trying to work within the regulations that are there. And so going back to benefits, going back to training, these are things that are helpful to workers, and I think we should look at it from the perspective of workers out, and what's helpful to the workers, and how do we, either as an industry or from a regulation perspective, help figure that out.
Now, in terms of, you said you tried out a bunch of different car companies, and so there's a lot happening in what we've been calling the on-demand space. And a lot of these companies have been kind of going under. They've been cutting back on their workforce, changing their policies. Brian, you mentioned that we're in a bit of an on-demand apocalypse. Would you mind talking about that?
That's not my quote. But,
what's actually happening here?
No, look, I think a lot of times there's this pendulum, and it swung from maybe a year or two ago that the assumption was that every company that got started in the space made sense and was going to exist and was going to be worth billions of dollars. And the pendulum now is swung to the other side, where the assumption is that everything's going to fall apart and everything's going to be a disaster. And at the end of the day, it comes back to a couple things. When you're building a marketplace, what is the value prop to both sides of the supply and demand? And does that value prop hold water? And can you make a decent margin off of that? So there are some companies that have done a very good job proving that out, and there are others where it's still very much TBD. The second piece is, how well are you able to operate that business? Like, these are not software companies like WhatsApp where you can have 20 people in a room and service tens of millions of people. these are operationally very complicated businesses, and so you need really talented operators who are able to cost effectively service both sides of the community. And I think a lot of companies got a free pass over the last couple of years to not really think about how to build cost-effective, scalable operations. And now that money's harder to come by, companies are having to figure that out. And the reality is that some businesses make sense, they should exist, and they're run by good teams. The ones that haven't done so well so far are the ones that the team just didn't make the right moves. Like that particular market space wasn't fundamentally different enough compared to the incumbents that people were already using. Not everything needs to be a push-button service from your phone. So I think it's going to shake out, but again, the underlying trends around mobile adoption, the underlying trends around the changes in the workforce, and I think some of the things that are coming online now, where you've got Uber and Postmates now having APIs, where you almost think about that as like an AWS-like service, where other people can build companies on top of that and not necessarily have to recruit an entire workforce to get going in a particular city. So I think there's a next wave of companies that's coming out, and I'm excited specifically because a lot of people are negative on the category. And so that's when the real innovation tends to happen.
Gotcha. I'm curious, Oisin, for Handy, what do you think are some of the good moves that your company has made, and have there been any bad ones?
I think
No bad ones.
I think that whether you're in an upcycle or a down cycle or a sideways cycle, there are always great companies being built. Exactly as Brian said, these are companies that are creating real value for customers, in our case, real value for pros, and platforms that have some sort of moat or defensibility. So with Handy, one of the things we noticed early on was that density was everything. So you'd come to the platform as a customer, you did a search for a cleaner. If we had availability at a time that suited you, you made the booking. The conversion was really high. Retention was high. The same thing on the supply side. If you came, you were onboarded. We've had over 1.3 million people apply to join Handy as pros. We've activated about 50,000 of them. Those people who have work in their city at a time that they want to work at, in an area they want to work, they stay on the platform. So we realized density was crucial. Customers drive bookings, bookings drive pros, pros drive availability, and that comes all the way back around and starts to spin. So we really invested very early on in making sure that as we went into cities, we only went in where we knew that we could get density. So we focused really aggressively on being deep in every city we were in, as opposed to being in hundreds and hundreds of cities before we were ready. Today we're in 28 cities, 25 in the US, 2 in Canada and London. We haven't launched a new city now in about 18 months. All of the growth we've seen has been same city growth. So we're seeing huge growth in the platform, all coming from existing cities. And I think that differentiation of, hey, let's just build a platform that's bigger because it rewards shareholders, or it's a bigger business, is different to saying, let's build a platform that's bigger because it actually builds a better experience. And I think it's important that it's better not just for consumers, but it's better for our pros as well. So I think that core idea of just going deeper and deeper into every market is at the heart of what Handy's all about.
Yeah, I look at the e-commerce wave of startups maybe 4 or 5 years ago as a really interesting proxy, where a lot of companies came out and they had some sort of scheme, some sort of subscription where it maybe didn't make sense for the product category. And at the end of the day, the companies that were successful were the ones that were able to build a brand, were amazing merchants, and understood how to turn inventory. And so even though these companies are being built online, at the end of the day, it came down to who's building a good retail operation. And I think the same thing will prove true here, where you'll see lots of schemes, you'll see people throwing, kind of good money after bad. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down who can run an amazing service operation. And that comes back to efficiency, that comes back to having the right tools, that comes back to instilling the right sort of service mentality in the workers. And so some people are going to get that right, and others aren't. But it comes back to, are you running an amazing service business, and the technology is helping you, but it's helping you run a great service business. It's not the end-all, be-all.
I think there's probably 3 main stakeholders in most of these platforms. You've got the customers, you've got the supply side, and you've got the team itself and investors. And there are lots of things you can do to move value from one of those parties to the other. So you can pay people less, you can charge customers more, you can decide to pass on a discount or not. Really, really focusing the team on how do we do things that create value for everybody, as opposed to just moving the value that exists around the platform across those three parties. And it's really easy to fall into a trap of, hey, I'm just going to move the value around, because it's value that you know is there and you can incrementally move it between parties. Whereas saying, hey, we're only going to do things, we're only going to build product features, create operational changes that actually make more value or create value for all three parties, I think is a really big mind shift that these platforms need to make.
Circling back to the worker side of the equation here, in terms of value, how does, with regard to our current, how we think of the on-demand economy and part-time workers, Handy, you believe in a portable benefit system, correct? Would you mind talking about that? And do you think that that's kind of a solution for these type of companies and making sure both the company and the workers are happy and delivering value?
Yeah, so I think this idea that your benefits need to be linked to your employer is just such an old idea, and it doesn't actually make sense in a world where people are dipping in and out of platforms, where they're working part-time here, part-time in another job. And it's actually not just a 1099 problem. It's not just a contractor problem. It exists in the W-2 world as well. And the idea is, what if you could take benefits and buy them on an hourly basis or buy them on a percentage of dollars earned basis, and you could buy those benefits completely agnostically of which platform you're on. And there are lots of challenges with it. So in a world where you are working one week and not working the next, the definition of what employment or unemployment looks like changes. The definition of what paid disability looks like changes. So there are really, really, really big challenges to be worked out. But we've got to get to a place where we understand how to create access to benefits, access to education, access to training for people who are choosing to work in a part-time way. The current situation where this is being litigated is not the answer. There's nobody who's, well, maybe the lawyers are doing very well out of litigation, but other than the lawyers, there's nobody who's winning in this litigation war that's happening right now. Not the platforms, not the customers, not the pros. So we've got to get past litigation and get into a world where we say, okay, let's solve this using legislation. Let's create an environment where the platforms are supportive, where people have access to benefits, have the flexibility they want, and yet the platforms still work. Because I think there's so many people's lives who are dependent on these platforms now who really want to use them to either earn money or to use them to get services. We've got to figure out the answer, and it's not litigation.
Awesome. And then, do you find it difficult to work on this when you're working on regulation that you may not actually see happening for like 5 or 10 years?
I think that if there are really big problems to be solved, and we think about Handy as this platform that's going to deliver every service to every home. So we start with cleaning. We've served well over 500,000 customers, over 2 million transactions in cleaning, and our view is that we want to build a platform that delivers every service to every home. That's a 10, 15, 20-year vision. It's okay for us to take a view that it's going to take 3, 4, 5 years to fix the regulatory problems that exist, because we have such a large vision and we know it's going to take us so long to get there.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I think investing in the category, when this whole W-2 questions were coming up around Uber, you get a lot of questions of, does this make you just want to hit the pause button looking at it? But at the end of the day, it impacts so many people, both on the customer satisfaction side as well as on the worker side, that if you can build something that, as Oisin said, like contributes value to all parties, there's an assumption that it might take a little while to figure it out, but of all the risks that you have building a company, that one's lower on the list. And this assumption that just because something happens to Uber, that means it's going to happen to every other category of worker. Uber has a lot of other realities competing against the taxi industry versus other industries that were much more 1099 or much more flexible to begin with. So I think it's one of these things that you almost have to operate understanding that it's going to change. But if you're focused on your customers and you're focused on your workers, good things should happen.
Awesome. Well, we're out of time. Thanks so much, Brian and
Thank you.
Oisin.
Thank you.